Hello everyone, welcome to GoVMlab VMware tutorial series for beginners lecture number 61. How to create and edit alarms in VMware vSphere environment part 2. In part 1 of this lecture, we had discussed about what is alarm and how VMware gives us a powerful built-in notification system using these alarms. We have also walked you through a lot of pre-configured alarms at the virtual machine level as well as at the host level, and we have learned how these alarms gets defined, and when a specific condition is being met as defined in the alarm rules, a respective alarm gets triggered to notify users about that specific event. In this particular lecture, we are going to learn how do we go and create our customized alarm, and let's see that how these alarms conditions are being created and what happens when specific conditions are being met. So let's get started. As you could see that I am logged into our vCenter server savcsa01.govmlab.local. Now let's go and browse our vCenter inventory. So we have a data center created as SA data center. Let's go and browse our data center. So we have a SA cluster created within that data center, and we also have a standalone ESXi host which is also part of that same data center. Now let's go and browse our cluster, and as you could see that we have created two node vSphere cluster and we have a two VMs running on that cluster. Whereas if we browse our standalone ESXi host, we also have a one test VM01 which is running on that specific ESXi host. Now and create let's go and create virtual machine specific alarm. So for that, click on the virtual machine, click on configure, click on alarm definitions, and you do see that we have a bunch of pre-configured alarms at the virtual machine level. Now let's go and try to create our own customized alarm. So to do that, click on the add button, and that's where we need to give the name of alarm. So let's give an alarm as VM. For example, let's give a name as VM CPU usage alarm. And what is the description? Description is that this alarm will get triggered whenever CPU usage of VM goes above, let's say 70%. Now we need to define the target type. So obviously, because we are creating an alarm at the virtual machine level, so our target would be virtual machine as it's clearly mentioned here. Click on the next. Now that's where we need to define the rules, the alarm rules. So for that we need to select a trigger. So click on this arrow and you do see that we have a bunch of options available. For capacity and usage, that's the category of alarms. As you could see that CPU ready time, usage, memory usage, network usage. We have a lot of metrics available. For the deployment, we have a lot of alarms like cannot migrate a VM, creating your virtual machine, deploying VM. So you could go and browse through all these metric and create your customized alarm based on your specific and application requirement. So for that, for now, as of now, we are actually creating an alarm which is very specific to CPU usage. So what we're gonna do, we actually gonna go and select the trigger as VM CPU usage, as you do see that. So we have select that a VM CPU usage is one of our trigger. Now we need to select that operator. What if my VM CPU usage is above the specific threshold? We need to define it. So in our case, we are defining a threshold because VMware is having a default alarm, and that default alarm, as we have seen that if your usage goes above 90%, it will trigger a critical alarm. If it goes above 75%, it will go and trigger a warning sign. But in our case, we want to customize this metric. So in our case, let's say we are more conservative in terms of a CPU usage approach. So we do see that whenever my alarm is above 60% for next, let's say 2 minutes, not 5 minutes. Let's say for 2 minutes, my VM usage is CPU usage is continuously above 60%. I want this trigger to happen. And the additional trigger, what we could say that if my VM CPU usage, and you do see that you can't have a duplicate triggers. So what we have to do, we actually go and first what we have to do, we need to go and trigger the alarm. You show it us as a warning. Now, as you could see that if my VM CPU usage is above 60% for next 2 minutes, what I want to happen, I want to show this alarm as a warning, right? Now, add another rule. The next rule says that if my VM CPU usage is above, let's say 80% for next consecutive 5 minutes, then please trigger the alarm as critical. Now that's how we have defined two rules, as you rightly see that on the left side. The alarm rule 1, which says that 60% usage, trigger it as a warning. Alarm rule 2, 80% CPU usage, please trigger as a critical alarm. Now the next is, what if everything comes back to normal state? What if my VM CPU usage goes below the threshold value of 60%? At that point of time, I want to reset this particular rule, which means that if the warning or critical condition state are no longer met, which means that my usage is not meeting those threshold value or it's below those threshold values, then I want this alarm to be reset as a normal. Name of the alarm is VM CPU usage alarm. This alarm will get triggered whenever CPU usage VM goes above, I think we need to correct this description, above 60%, what we have seen it. Now what the alarm rule says, that's a very important thing. It says that if VM CPU usage is above 60% for next 2 minutes, please trigger the alarm as a warning. But if my CPU usage is above 80% for next consecutive 5 minutes, then please trigger this alarm as critical. And if my CPU usage is not meeting this criteria, which means that it is below 60%, then please trigger this alarm as a normal or reset this alarm as normal. Obviously, there is a knob for enabling or disabling this alarm. So yes, we are creating this alarm. We want this alarm to be enabled. So let's keep it as it is. Click on create. Now, once we click on create, we do see that our new alarm would have got created. And that's the alarm. You do rightly see it here. VM CPU usage alarm. And this is the alarm what we have created at the virtual machine object level. Now, if you want to reconfirm it again, just click it here and then you again reconfirm your alarm that it's the same alarm what we have created. Now let's see that how this alarm will really work it out. So for that, what we have to do, we need to generate a CPU load in one of our virtual machine to test this particular alarm. So for that, let's go to our virtual machine, click on summary, click on console, and let's go and try to increase the CPU usage. But before increasing that CPU load, let's just see that what is the current usage as of now. Run the top command and we do see that there is not much usage, CPU usage on our virtual machine. As of now, everything looks good. And let's review the same thing at the host level also. So let's log into our ESXi host. So let's see that which host this VM is running on. This VM is running on SA-ESXi02. So let's log into our SA-ESXi02 host and execute the command ESXtop. And we do see that the test VM02 usage, CPU usage are very less. It means that as of now, everything looks very normal. The CPU usage of that particular VM is very low. Now let's go and pump the CPU load inside our virtual machine. So to do that, we need to run this particular command. So we can execute this command. It's basically a loop, a for loop we are running continuously in our virtual machine, which continuously will be looking for CPU cycles and would be generating CPU load. So execute this command and let's execute the top command again and look at that. Let's look at the CPU usage. CPU 0, it shows that 100%, which means that your CPU, your application inside your virtual machine is continuously looking for CPU cycles. And let's verify the same from our ESXi host itself. And you do see that our test VM02, the CPU usage is close to 100%, which means that we have successfully increased the CPU usage on our virtual machine. Now let's log into our vCenter server and look at that for our virtual machine. Do we see that alarm has got triggered for our virtual machine or not? So to do that, click on that alarms as well. So click on this task pane and look at that. As of now, because we have set the alarm, as soon as my virtual machine CPU usage goes above 60% for next 2 minutes, then please trigger alarm as warning. And when it goes above the 80% for next consecutively 5 minutes, then please trigger the alarm as critical. So let's wait for 2 minutes and let's see that do we see these alarms getting triggered. And now look at that. As soon as after 2 minutes, we do see that the alarm has got triggered as a CPU usage. A VM CPU usage alarm has got triggered, and look at the sign of our virtual machine. It shows yellow sign, which means it's a warning. Now, because we define the alarm that for the next 5 minutes, if the CPU usage goes above 80%, then this alarm state will change from warning to critical. So let's wait for that alarm to get triggered. So let's wait for 5 minutes and let's see that the state of the state of this alarm gets changed from warning to critical state. And now look at that. Our virtual machine state has changed. Our virtual machine alarm state has changed. And now we do see that a red critical sign of our alarm. And look at the icon. A new icon got added to our virtual machine, which is actually telling us that our virtual machine is in critical state, which means that the second condition what we had defined has successfully met, and because of that the sign has changed from yellow to red, telling us that this particular virtual machine is in critical state. So that clearly identifies that as soon as the conditions what we have defined is being met, the respective alarms is being triggered. Now click on that particular task and you do see that we do see that this particular alarms has got triggered successfully. Now click on the monitor, and in the monitor section you do see that we have two alarms. So you might be wondering why it's showing the two alarms. The reason why are we seeing two alarms, virtual machine CPU usage as well as the CPU usage alarm, because this particular alarm is a VMware default alarm. So obviously that alarm will also has to get triggered because they have set the threshold as a 90%, whereas our alarm we have set the threshold value. In our alarm we had set the threshold value as 80%. So this is the alarm what we have created, and this is the alarm what VMware is having a default alarm. That's the reason we are seeing these two alarm which got triggered as a alert. So this conclude our lecture on how do we go and create our own customized alarm and tune these alarm rules or conditions based on our application specific requirement or our environment specific parameters. In the next lecture, in the continuation of our alarms, in the next lecture, I'm actually going to show you another different kind of alarms, what we call it as a event-driven alarms. These particular alarms are a very specific category of alarm called as condition-driven alarms, where a one specific condition will be met, this alarm will trigger. In the next lecture, we're going to discuss about the event-specific alarms, where a specific event gets occurred, what will happen as a corrective action for that specific event. So stay tuned for our next lecture. We hope you enjoyed this lecture. Thanks for your time. Please like, share and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you.